There is deep financial insecurity, and there are multiple ways to respond to that as politicians. We have seen currently those who are reaching for the old tools, blame, fear, othering, and they have attracted voters. So what do? Two things. Our politics and our systems have to be responsive to people's needs.
COVID's a really interesting section in the book, I think. Did the anger surprise you?
It worried me deeply and it saddened me.
We have this war going on effectively between Israel and Iran. If you were in power now, what would you be saying?
When children are the casualties of warfare, the complex should become simple. The war needs to end.
Hello and welcome to Ways to Change the World. I'm Krishnagiri, and this is the podcast in which we talk to extraordinary people about the big ideas in their lives and the events that have helped shape them. My guest today is the most globally famous and lauded New Zealand Prime Minister of modern times, Jacinda Ardern. Her international profile began with her being the world's youngest head of government at 37, who within months had a baby and took it all in her stride. But it was her response to the horrific terrorist attack on mosques in Christchurch that gave her hero status amongst progressives around the world, embracing the Muslim community in New Zealand and passing strict gun laws in response. Her 6 years as Prime Minister also meant dealing with the COVID pandemic and the fury and conspiracy theories around lockdowns and vaccines that came with it, many of which targeted her personally. And then in January 2023, almost as suddenly as she had arrived on the global stage, she stood down. Her book, A Different Kind of Power, is perhaps the most sensitive and candid account of a leader you could ask for, framed around her desire to be remembered for her kindness. Jacinda, welcome.
Thank you very much.
If you could change the world in any way, how would you change it?
I would try to ensure that we had more people in political leadership who valued kindness and empathy in their leadership. And I think that there are leaders out there like that, but there's not a lot of incentives in politics currently to put those styles of leadership on display.
I mean, kindness is an odd political ambition to talk about.
It is.
In these days. Why was that in your mind so early on?
Do you know, I remember just thinking about the things that I valued as a person. And I think actually when you ask people about the things that, for instance, they wish to teach their children as character traits, the things that you really want to be highly prized as a parent, you'll probably list off things like curiosity, generosity, bravery and courage, but kindness is so often in that list as well. But sometimes somehow we've created a separation around the things we value in our homes and our daily lives and what we expect in our leaders. For me, in New Zealand, kindness became an important value, not just in what we did, but how we did it. I had a concern that, especially if you'd spent 9 years in opposition as we had, that people start to see you as relentlessly negative, dogmatic, perhaps not focused on the issues that are important to you. So kindness became a value frame for the way that we wanted to do politics as well.
So what did that mean for policy, the way you would look at things?
Well, two things, like in really practical terms. I mean, we've got a Westminster style of government.
Oppositional.
So it's oppositional, it's adversarial. It means that the debating chamber is like it's like a bull ring. It's quite feisty. There's, a lot of heckling. And look, I was never going to change the traditions. But from the moment that we started our campaign, I said, even though we're opposition, we will be positive in our campaign. We will talk about ideas, about change. But really importantly, we will not attack other politicians personally. So, for example, if there was ever a scandal or anything that personally affected some other member of another party, we wouldn't engage in it. It wasn't for us, it was for them, it was for their leadership team. And then when it came to policy, it's simply people-centric policy making. And ensuring as well that you're not being performative. If there is a crisis, if there is a tragedy, that your empathy, your human approach was also followed through with action.
I mean, if you don't attack your opposite numbers on those sorts of scandals, then you're giving away a political opportunity to some degree. I mean, when you say our system doesn't incentivize that kind of behavior, kindness, What do you mean? What's wrong with it?
Well, first of all, I'd say that it's important to always hold to account your political opposition on their ideas and their policies. You never give that away. That's, of course, important to have a good contest of ideas. But that doesn't mean that we have to succumb to the idea of personally attacking individuals, bringing their families in, or ploughing into what might be personal scandal. That there has in the past been codes of that nature in politics, but they've ebbed away over time. And secondly, the idea of this, what are the incentives for politicians? I mean, for the most part, of course, politicians are successful if people vote for them. People vote for them if they first and foremost have name recognition. And your old measures for that, of whether or not your constituents will know who you are, is whether or not you have coverage, is whether or not you're in the headlines or you've made the news or a story of the day. Increasingly, and this is no one's fault, it's the environment we're in a commercialised environment, people click on and read those things that bring out rage or anger or disbelief, less likely to click on those things where a politician has, drafted a bill that's of use or come up with a policy idea or working on consensus with an opposition member of parliament. And yet that is ultimately, well, I still believe voters are looking for. It's just not what they're seeing. And that's why I think we have a disillusionment with politics. What's covered is not necessarily what is happening day in, day out in our politics.
I mean, it's not an appealing world, is the truth, is it?
It's not.
We don't get the best people going into politics.
Well, we've got to think about whether we have a branding problem. And, I knew when I was there, people were always interested or why you were there. Politics is, though, at its heart, it's still a noble act of public service, but that's not what people see on the label anymore. So I do think we need to do some work to reclaim that. It's a privileged position. What other places can you affect genuine change and solve problems that, might be incredibly confronting for your communities and see the difference that you make in your day-to-day job? That's incredible. We want the best people for that job.
I mean, it's fashionable to think that you came out of nowhere. Obviously, you didn't. You'd been at it for years and years, and you were in opposition for a long time.
Yes.
How did you hold on to your idealism in a world of sort of nasty politics?
I think in a way, I just gave up on the idea of being successful. And I think when you lack a bit of that personal ambition, it helps because, you do hold on to a set of ideas about the way that you want to do things and accept that might mean that you're not particularly successful. I'd like to think, though, that the lesson I was not by any means a perfect politician at all, but I do hope that one lesson could be that if you are driven by the ideas of empathetic leadership, if you do value things like kindness and you are totally focused on these acts of public service, there is a place for you and you can succeed. I had the opportunity to test whether or not the public would vote for those values, and they did. I think we should put that to the test more often.
So when you go and talk to young people about why they should go into public service, and they look around the world and they see, angry populists doing really, really well, what do you say to them about why you should?
I think we need to dig a little deeper into that. I mean, one of the problems we have is this is a bit self-fulfilling at the moment. Edelman do a global survey of trust and confidence, and what they're finding at the moment is over 60% of people feel grievance. They feel grievance towards politics, but they also increasingly feel grievance towards the private sector as well. And that sense of grievance means that they don't feel that their problems are being answered or issues responded to. And I think you can see some of the patterns around that. A third of people don't think the next generation will be better off than they did. And that's something historically you've looked to as an indicator for politics. There is deep financial insecurity, I think, out there off the back of the shock of a global pandemic. And there are multiple ways to respond to that as politicians. We have seen currently those who are reaching for the old tools, blame, fear, othering. Those ideas are some of the oldest political tricks in the book. And they have attracted voters. I don't think always because they totally align on every ideology. I don't think that people voting for that means that, everyone favours far-right ideology. But they are feeling that sense of grievance from the old system. So what do? Two things. Our politics and our systems have to be responsive to people's needs. It might be that we need to dig into whether or not our electoral systems are meeting their needs, whether they feel their vote is counting. And secondly, we have to get better at delivering, particularly in the space of financial insecurity.
So how do you rate your own delivery on core domestic issues?
There were areas absolutely where we were struggling to keep up with, for instance, the huge cost of living impacts that followed COVID. Absolutely, that was tough. And I think you see that in many Western liberal democracies, those governments who not just governed through COVID, but governed in the aftermath of COVID have struggled with that. But that says to me that some of the critical things you need in those periods are a good financial safety net. We certainly tried to increase the value of ours. You need constant lifelong access to education in a changeable environment where there's rapid technological change. And you need good access to the basics in life like healthcare. On all three of those measures, you look to a society like the United States, people often feel there's fragility in those areas.
And do you think our systems, our political systems, also make it harder to deliver?
I think there's a couple of things going on. I think people have an expectation of quick delivery, and that's not unreasonable, but the scale of change that's sought sometimes, our systems aren't always able to keep up. You require, for instance, good infrastructure in your public service, but we go through a yo-yoing where one government will break that down, reduce down their core public service and the expertise that exists within it, and the next government will spend years rebuilding it. So there are some things that become harder to deliver on. The second point I'd make is many Western liberal democracies have struggled with the provision of things like housing, most of which have a multitude of issues affecting the delivery, whether it sits within resource consenting or the role of the private sector. Complex, but when it comes to the nuts and bolts, voters just want decent, affordable housing, and many of us have struggled with that too.
Yes, I mean, these are the two things this government here is struggling with.
They're not alone.
Desperately trying to get things back up to speed in their terms. I mean, do you look at it and think, well, you're not going to do it? I mean,
I'm very cautious about ever commenting on anyone else's domestic politics because, first of all, I'm not embedded in it, and don't have the insight required to make such.
But these are the same issues the world over.
But I think what we'll see is there is a consistency of issue. But I'm really interested in the likes of Ezra Klein and those who speak of this notion of abundance. When I think the notion of the importance but difficulty of swift delivery in an environment where people, not unfairly, have expectations of their politicians and their systems.
In terms of your values, I mean, you talk about your childhood in the book, daughter of a policeman, a Mormon family.
Yeah.
Is that where the values come from?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, when I came to write the memoir, and it's not, I'd like to think it's not a normal political memoir, it's a story really of, if you don't expect to be a leader, how does that happen? And I think there's lots of things that can lead you into a life of politics. And I try to just list what I think might be some of mine. Well, not list them, but just share insights into them. My father was a policeman. I was raised in a Mormon family. I had family members who cared deeply about politics. All of those things may have played out, but so too might have just been the places I lived.
Well, what do you think was unique about, I mean, your childhood in New Zealand, though, is different. New Zealand's a very different place to urban Britain. What do you think you get from that kind of upbringing that is different in terms of your outlook?
Do you know, I think the fact that I grew up with two female prime ministers before me meant that I never grew up believing that my gender would get in the way of me having. No, I did not. What I did think, though, was that my personality absolutely would get in the way. And by that, I mean, I had a bit of a confidence gap. You might call it imposter syndrome. I was very thin-skinned. I worried about the world. All of those things that you'd think wouldn't give you enough resilience for politics. But the difference for me in New Zealand is that I think, we're not a hierarchical place. We are egalitarian. We have an accessible democracy. And that is... I'd like to think that other places will have elements of that, but that is something that's very pronounced, I think, in New Zealand. So I could go from being amongst the first in my family to go to university to also being Prime Minister.
I mean, you end up concluding in the book effectively that imposter syndrome, insecurity, all of those things are or can be strengths.
Absolutely. And we don't talk about them in that way. And that was one of the reasons I wanted to write the book.
Just unpack it. I mean, why is it good?
Well, those character traits, which we've been taught to believe are flaws, they don't sit there in isolation. You will do something to try and compensate for it. And in my experience, that meant additional preparation, always anticipating risk, bringing in experts, advisors, humility. And I think actually when you face a crisis, like for instance, say COVID, you want experts to be around the table. You want leaders seeking out the best possible advice. And we probably want a bit of humility too. So I think the trick is seeing those elements as a strength in leadership and trying to not allow something like imposter syndrome to overwhelm you or hold you back from taking on opportunities.
I mean, COVID's a really interesting section in the book, I think. And, you describe how you had to sort of wrestle with to what extent you level with the public.
Yeah, there was a really difficult period that we had in COVID. There was almost COVID in two parts, the part before the vaccines and the part after when we were in rollout of the vaccines. And when Delta came into New Zealand, it was a very difficult period where it looked like, unlike before, we weren't going to be able to get rid of it. And top of my mind all the way through was these dual goals of saving people's lives, but also bringing people with us. And whilst we saved an estimated 20,000 lives and we had fewer days in lockdown than most countries, I didn't manage to keep everyone together. And so I spent a bit of time trying to reflect on that in the book.
I mean, would it ever have been possible, do you think, given the world we're now in and conspiracy theories and social media and
it's something
fake
I
news?
grapple with as well, because I think no country had an experience in isolation. And we see, I think, through our experience, just how connected we are, not just at a practical level in the way that this pandemic moved through the world, but the way ideas, the way information, the way disinformation moved through the world. And that's something we have to come to terms with, particularly if we want to ensure that our democracies remain healthy and that we learn again how to have good, robust debate with one another, healthy protest, the engagement that we're used to without it turning to violence.
Did the anger surprise you?
Did it surprise me? I think it worried me deeply and it saddened me. I'm not sure at that point whether I would have considered it a complete surprise because there was some build up to that. You saw it brewing, you could feel the sentiment. And of course, we weren't alone in it.
I mean, I had an old school friend who had moved to New Zealand at the time who started sending me these furious messages about how her life had been ruined by you. And I remember being surprised by it, thinking there's something weird going on here, And it's not surprising, obviously, that conspiracy theories took hold, but there was a sureness around it amongst those people. They were absolutely, because the thing about people taking the decisions, I suppose you were wrestling with what the right thing to do was and you weren't really sure. People on the other side were absolutely 100% sure that they were right.
Well, to be clear, the thing I was very clear on was the right thing to do was to try and preserve life, was to try and ensure that where we knew something would make a difference to save lives, that we were very clear-minded about that. Where it became difficult was, of course, at the point we were in the midst of both rolling out a vaccination whilst grappling with how we transitioned into a world where COVID was in our community, which was always going to be an endpoint. That transition was hard. The experience that you relay, I mean, it wasn't the majority of New Zealanders, but it did exist, that sentiment did exist for some. And the reflection for me is not to sit and say that there wasn't a contribution of government policy to the way people felt. We have to take accountability for that. But let's also recognise that some of that was happening then for public servants. Some people with high profiles in medicine and science experienced that anger towards them as well. And globally, not just in New Zealand, I looked abroad and suddenly realised that this is not isolated. And that therefore means that there is a challenge that sits well beyond just a singular time in office and a singular leader.
What was it frightening for you personally? I mean, you got threats. There were threats towards your family.
And not to trivialise this, but increasingly that is the world for politicians. And that does not mean that is okay, but it does mean that I don't consider myself a special case.
But how did you feel about it? When you're getting death threats or threats of violence towards your family, not just towards you, what do you think when you're sitting there in a position of power?
I think I have a job to do and I do it.
You just ignore it? You can't ignore it though, can you?
Well, if you dwell on it, then what? You have a job to do. You're elected to do it. And I was very clear-eyed in that. I think again as well, I do consider myself very, an empathetic leader, but that does not mean that I coexist with frailty. I consider myself resilient because I'm so clear-eyed on what I feel is important, and my job was one of service. So I remain pretty focused on that.
Let's just go back to Christchurch, because I think that's where I think the world suddenly saw you as something different, and where empathy as a leader was really noticed. You seem to know exactly how to respond immediately. Was it an instinctive response?
Yeah, I think that's probably the only way to describe it. But I also would say that it was also the way you saw New Zealanders respond. So I very much felt like I was part of what was a nationwide response, not necessarily one that I singularly determined. That was New Zealanders pushed back on what was ultimately the goal of a white supremacist to try and seed hate and division. They clearly rejected that, and I happened to absolutely share that view, and I hope in my own way lead on that too.
Things like wearing a head covering. I mean, again, did you think about that, or did you just do it?
No, not really. I remember thinking, I'm going down to Christchurch, I'll be amongst the community. This is a practice. It feels, instinctively, it felt to me solely as the most respectful thing I could do in a moment in time that was, it was a targeted attack against the Muslim community. It was their grief that they were carrying. It was their family. It was their loved ones that had been lost. And so for me, it was just the natural thing to do.
In terms of the international response, you famously spoke to Donald Trump. Just tell us about that interaction, what you wanted from him and what you got.
I don't remember particularly having an agenda. One of the things that happens in the aftermath of events like this is leaders do reach out. They share their grief, they offer assistance. And so when that opportunity came from the American president, is there anything the United States can do for you? I remember just thinking, well, actually, right now, just love and support for all Muslim communities. That was felt to me like the most important thing that anyone could do at that time.
You didn't get that?
Well, that's not for me to judge. That would be for the Muslim community to judge.
But you must have noticed that the reaction was not.
Well, at that point in time,
the one you wanted. I mean, presumably you didn't think that you would get that from
keeping
him,
in mind that at that point in time there was already what was coined a Muslim ban in the United States when it came to refugees. So that was already in place when I made that comment.
What did that tell you about him?
Look, ultimately, he obviously took a very particular view on immigration policy, which obviously would be at odds with my perspective, but I don't think that will be news to anyone.
No, but I mean, we're seeing it again now. So, and you live in America now, you live in Boston.
I think what we're seeing is a form of leadership that is not unique to one country. I think we're seeing it in a number of different quarters now. And as I say, when we see deep financial insecurity and populations seeking answers, politicians often will, seek to blame or weaponize fear. And we do see that, and we see particular communities being targeted. And again, as I say, not just one country, but many adopting that approach. I do not believe that will ultimately offer for voters the answers that they're looking for. And so my hope is that over time we will have politicians ready with the policy responses that voters seek.
I mean, you now have a position at Harvard University, which is obviously being targeted by the administration. Do you know, for example, whether you're included in their foreign ban?
Yeah, here I would say that, look, I am a fellow. I'm not faculty. I'm not at the heart of these issues. And my time at Harvard has allowed me, the biggest thing for me is it allowed me the time to sit, reflect, learn from students and maintain my optimism, even in this moment of time. And my optimism comes from the young people that I spend time with, that in spite of what is occurring around them, they hold on to the fact that they have a role to play, regardless of whether or not they see their values being reflected in any current administration.
I mean, optimism right now, if you're a foreign student at Harvard, it's pretty hard, isn't it, I'd imagine?
Not from what I've seen, that's still there.
Really?
Yes. Yeah.
In what form? I mean,
I think,
what can you be optimistic about in that situation, given everything that's going on around you?
My interpretation of optimism is that it is not naivety, it's expectation. It's an expectation and belief that leaders should be and will do better. And I think the moment that we lose that optimism is the moment we tip into indifference. If I saw indifference, I think I would be much more worried, but I don't.
Do you think there are enough people, though, who have that expectation?
I do.
Of their politicians? Because, I mean, a lot of people are, perhaps not indifferent, but looking the other way a lot of the time.
I think the thing, coming back again to what some of the research and insights is telling us, if we know that 60% of people hold some grievance, that still tells us they have an expectation that politics is there to serve them in some way. I think the worrying thing is that 4 out of 10 people believe hostile acts are justified in this current environment. We do need to make sure that we're being responsive, and we also need to make sure that we cultivate an environment where people do no longer believe that it's acceptable to engage in those hostile acts, and instead find ways to engage in their democracies where they see them being responsive and they feel that they're being reflective of their needs.
What did you learn from winning the election midway through your time as Prime Minister, when you were going through this very, very difficult time in COVID? Labour hadn't won a majority for a long time.
Well, no one had since MMP had come in 1996.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And suddenly, despite all this controversy, you take Labour to an unprecedented victory.
Yeah, well, actually, the COVID approach, as I say, was a COVID approach of too hard. So a really difficult period came later in COVID. That, it was, widely supported at that time. And so I saw it as that victory. I try and describe it in the book. It didn't feel like this straight, normal victory. I didn't feel like celebrating. For me, it was a request from New Zealanders to keep going, just to keep doing my job. And at that time, it was a very hard job.
How long did you think the instructions keep going lasted?
Well, I mean, ultimately, when I decided it was time to go, there was not anything particularly spicy happening in the political agenda. COVID and the disruption around it, was a year behind us. It was important to me, actually, that we were in relatively calm waters when I made the decision. Only a few points shy of where we were when we were elected. But for me, the question was, is it the right thing to do to run again? Do I have enough in the tank? And the answer for me was, not if I want to be the kind of leader I think New Zealand deserves.
I mean, you talk a little bit about how you'd started losing a bit of patience.
Yeah, I felt a bit more defensive, and that was something I really valued in leadership. I talk a little bit about whether or not my patience was waning a bit. All of those things that I thought were important, I was worrying about.
Was that a sort of symptom of tiredness, or?
Well, I did think I could have kept going. I believe that. It was not burnout per se, but it was this idea of whether there was enough in reserve. And when you're in leadership like that, where you have to expect the unexpected, you need something in reserve.
I mean, a lot of the book is about you as a mother, and the time that you were able to spend and weren't able to spend with your daughter. I mean, what did you end up concluding about that? Because obviously you had all the sort of the skepticism and the sort of the impertinent questions before about, what were you planning to do and were you going to be a mum and all the rest of it? You do it. And then a few years in, I suppose, your daughter was 5 when you stepped down. What did you conclude about being a woman in your position as a young mother, and how easy it is and how easy it should be?
I think that there are women all over the world juggling caregiving roles and significant leadership or roles outside of their caregiving. And I don't think I need to prove that you can do it all, because they already do. But the point that I would rather try and make is they shouldn't be expected to do it alone. I was very privileged that I had a support network, and I believe all women should have that support network. And the second thing I learned was that actually, even if you're doing a job like leading a country, you still feel like you should be with your children all of the time. And I don't know that there's any job that stops you feeling that way. And maybe there's some comfort in knowing that. But maybe we should also give ourselves some grace to want the same things for ourselves in our lives that we actually want for our children.
I mean, you had a support network of both your husband and your parents. Obviously, not everybody has that.
No, not everyone does.
So what needs to happen for people who don't have that?
Governments have a role to play. You know, some of the things we did, we extended paid parental leave to 6 months. We increased the payments for sole parents. We increased childcare subsidies. We put in place a universal tax credit for the first year of a child's life. You know, our goal was to try and give families more choices, not a particular position on whether you should be at home or whether you should be in work. We instead wanted families to have more choices. And it was a work in progress, but that's the kind of role I believe government also has to play.
You bring it round at the end to calling a journalist, funnily enough, a journalist who you'd spoken to in the car on the way. Just tell us that story. I mean, it's a funny thing to do, I suppose, to call a journalist on your way to your big announcement. What was in your head?
Well, just because on the way to being sworn in, it was quite an unusual thing to be interviewed in a car on the way to be sworn into being Prime Minister. And quite a few people had commented to me that it felt like a really interesting time capsule of sorts, because while we were having the conversation, it was, well, what kind of government do you want to be? And where are you now? What's your location? And so it was an interesting observational interview. So as I drove to resign, I felt like maybe it would be an interesting observational piece to just share that moment with that same journalist, and not particularly for any purpose other than just to record the moment.
Just while you're with us, can I ask you, and I don't know whether you want to talk about this or not, but I mean, the world is in a very, very difficult place right now.
Yes.
We have this war going on effectively between Israel and Iran. If you were in power now, there's a G7 summit going on. If you were there, what would you be saying?
I think that even the most complex of international diplomacy can sometimes come down to very simple concepts. And I think most people understand that when children are the casualties of warfare, then that's the moment that actually the complex should become simple. The war needs to end. And we need to be able to accept that two truths can be held at the same time, that what happened on October 7th was wrong, and that what is happening now in the aftermath is also wrong. That is what I hope that leaders around the table have their eye to, the complexities, the depth of the history, all held, but keeping in mind the devastation that we now see wreaked particularly on children. I
mean, children are always the victims of war, aren't they? Of every war. I mean, so there's nothing unique about that right now. It's just on our screens in a very, very distressing way.
It is, and that the additional layer of that is if we want to restore people's sense of humanity and belief in multilateral institutions and the ability of diplomacy and politics to solve problems, that would be a good place to start.
Do you think that's possible, given how much erosion of the UN, particularly by Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu, there's been?
Well, I have not given up my expectation.
And is there fuel in your tank now?
Yeah, I guess it's a
You've had
different
plenty of
kind
time to refuel, haven't you? Because people wonder whether you fancy a global role.
Oh, no, I see very much at the moment, people ask me a lot about whether I go back into politics in New Zealand, and the answer for me is no, because I made that decision to leave. Now I enjoy things like I have a fellowship on empathetic leadership. I enjoy the role of supporting others who are still there and proving that there is a place in politics for kindness and empathy.
UN Secretary General?
Oh, God. Why would you pitch it?
Well, you're the one who believes in international institutions.
I do. It doesn't mean that I have to be the one to do it.
Jacinda Ardern, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing your way to change the world. That's it for this week. Until next time, bye-bye.